Welcome back to DEC Does What. I'm your host, Sean Mahar, pronouns he, him.
And I'm Erica Ringwald, she, her.
And we're excited to be joined by two of our invasive species experts here at DEC, Cathy McGlynn and Jessica Cancelliere. Cathy, Jess, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sean. Good to be here.
Excited to have you on. We're coming out of Invasive Species Awareness Week here in New York State, where we're trying to encourage all New Yorkers to pay attention to what's growing and breeding all around them that aren't supposed to necessarily be here. And you two are on the front lines of our invasive species work, and we're excited to have this conversation today. We obviously had a great Invasive Species Awareness Week out in the field. I was up with you, Cathy, I believe last week at our Clean, Drain, and Dry event, really kicking off boating season in New York. And reminding boaters that they have an important role to play in stopping the spread of invasive species. So, Cathy, maybe let's start there as it's fresh on my mind. When we say clean, drain, and dry, what do we mean?
Okay, so basically we expect folks to clean, drain, and dry their boats, whether it's motorized or not, before they arrive at a launch. So that could be basically washing down the hull of the boat, draining the bilge and any other water-containing compartments. And if you've used it in the past, make sure that it's been out in the sun, the drying part. Make sure it's been out in the sun for at least 5 days before you go to a new location. In the wintertime, you could be at below freezing temps for three days, and that should work. So that's the basics of the clean, drain, dry.
And, well, you don't always have to wait for sunlight, because I believe Mike, our producer here, caught me in some pictures drying off a boat with some of the awesome towels that we provide boaters as well.
That's a good point. And the towels come out each year in different colors. So hopefully everybody's very excited about the new edition, which will be pink.
I know. I can't wait for that one. I have an orange one now, but the pink one looked really cool. So I hope you all make sure that the commissioner up here gets some of these towels as we produce fun things.
We'll make sure to deliver those in person.
Thank you very much for that, Cathy. So Cathy and Jess, you both work for the Division of Lands and Forests here at DEC. And, you know, obviously invasive species are a big threat to forest health. But Jess, why don't you take us away on sort of your role here in the Division of Lands and Forests and what you're working on as it pertains to invasive species?
Sure. Well, I am a research scientist and the Forest Health Section Chief, which just means I manage the Forest Health Program. We have several components to the program. Essentially, let me talk for a minute about what forest health actually means, and then a little bit about the work we do. So healthy forests are those that can, over time, maintain their structure and all of the ecological processes within them, and that are also able to withstand stress, disturbance, stress. That stress could be in the form of climate change or invasive species, or even just a weather event like a big storm, right? So we essentially monitor the health of forest ecosystems across New York State, and then we develop and execute strategies to protect those ecosystems. A lot of my job is really about prioritization, because we're really being inundated with a lot of different threats right now. So it's kind of about looking at what forest ecosystems are being most impacted, which are providing the most ecological benefits, and which ones are ones that we can actually manage and do something about. So the program, like I said, monitoring is a big component, early detection of new pests and invasive species. And what we're currently building right now is more of a restoration component to our program, trying to complete the cycle, like not only removing invasive species or suppressing invasive species, but trying to bring those forests back to a more intact state, you know, especially when there's been significant damage from a particular pest or disease.
So are you like an EMT for trees? And is that what you consider yourself as a forest health expert?
I think so. It does feel a little bit like triage sometimes.
Oh, triage.
Heck yeah.
That was great.
And we have our lab as well. So the forest health program is very operational, but we have this lab section, which is essentially like our research and diagnostic arm. The research side of things, you know, we investigate new pests and monitor them in order to make more informed management decisions, essentially. And also to help us understand like what we're dealing with and what the real threat is. The diagnostic side is really the public service component of the lab. We help landowners and homeowners resolve their tree health issues. So you don't have to own a forest. We can just help you with the trees in your backyard. We also just do like general insect ID. If you have a bug coming into your house and you don't know what it is, we can tell you. But if you have trees that are declining in your backyard and you don't know why, we'll help you figure it out.
What are some of the biggest threats to New York's forests right now?
I think right now it would be climate change and invasive species because they interact together so much. They're exacerbating each other, and we can talk about that at some point. But climate change has even impacted the behavior of our native pests and diseases that historically have been relatively harmless or better kept in check by the current conditions. So climate change is changing weather patterns in a way where even previously harmless species are becoming problematic.
Can you give me an example of a species that has sort of changed its range or its behavior because of climate change?
Yeah, well, a really obvious example would be southern pine beetle, which is not so southern anymore. It's
right.
Historically a Central American and southern United States pest. And it's been moving northward. It arrived on Long Island in 2014, and we expected it to move northward, but the pace at which it's moved northward has shocked us all. By 2022, we had found it in Warrensburg, in Queensbury, within the Adirondack Blue Line. So upstate, it hasn't caused tree mortality yet, but on Long Island, it's caused a lot of ecological destruction. So its real threat upstate is not quite understood yet. It could be big. Winter temperatures are playing a role for sure. We have a lack of minimum winter temperatures. It's just not getting cold enough to keep populations in check. And that's the case with most of the invasives that we work with. So that's an example of a range expansion. But there's other things like around 2013, we started seeing landscape level decline of white pine across the state. The needles were turning brown in May and then falling from the tree in June. And after years of investigation, we discovered that it was a complex of native pathogens that were affecting the needles, needle blights, essentially. And so if you look back through the historical record, there's really no big records of, landscape level damage or even significant damage. It was just things that popped up here and there, maybe impacted a few trees here and there, but not a big deal. And then suddenly we see this huge statewide expansion of it. And looking into it, we found factors like increased fall drought were responsible and increased spring rain. So our annual precipitation hasn't changed much, but it's all coming in these very discrete, intense periods. So trees are either under drought conditions or they're being inundated with rain. And it's causing conditions that are favorable to the growth of these needle blights and also stressing trees out. So we deal with countless things just like that, where, the environmental factors are just making it worse.
So how adaptable and resilient are forests generally? And, are they able to overcome these threats, or does it, take more work for us? And are there more factors that we have to consider?
I think naturally forests are pretty resilient. But as you know, we've played a large role in the current structure of forest and the distribution of different tree species. We have impacted our forests greatly by our actions over the last 100 and 150 years. So I think we've created conditions that are not so resilient. And it's our job, I see it in forest health, to change that, to change the conditions statewide as much as we can to bring that resiliency back.
Well, the governor has us on a 25 million tree goal here in the state, so we're working really hard to create the forests of the future, and glad to have you on the front lines. But Cathy, I want to hear a little bit more about you, of sort of what is your day-to-day work as an invasive species coordinator, and what does your average day look like here at DC?
There is no average day. So I can be in the field, I can be in the office, I can be helping out lake associations or other public entities like towns or villages. I could be at a professional meeting presenting about our projects and research. So it just varies all the time, which is why I like it so much. But I think a big part of what I do these days is I help to manage some large-scale hydrilla infestation projects. Like we have hydrilla in Cayuga Lake and Erie Canal, so we actually have regional coordinators who manage those, and I help with those projects, as well as we work on several other projects on Long Island. We have the Peconic River, where we are hoping to control Ludwigia and several other invasive plants there as well. So that's a big part of what I do. I also work with our new statewide Watercraft Inspection Steward Program coordinator to help oversee that statewide Watercraft Inspection Steward Program, which includes, distributing all of those great tchotchkes we give out to the kids and the parents, and also developing new products to educate those folks. So that's a big part of what we do during the summertime. And then in the fall, we do the data analyses and regrouping on the projects and figuring out how to tweak those management projects to make them more efficient. And also just, again, talking through, like, what can we do to make the boating season better for the public? And are there other locations where we need to put stewards? There are new ways we can reach new target audiences. So we have these conversations constantly. We sort of use adaptive management throughout our entire AIS, or Aquatic Invasive Species program, because it's always good to revisit and sort of reflect on how is this working, and using the data from that particular year or the feedback we get from the public to assess where we can tweak the program to make it better.
So are there a lot of you working in the state on these issues, and does the state have a lot of capacity, or are you sort of a lone wolf out there trying to inspire more actions?
For the first 3 years, I was the lone wolf howling, but we actually have a bunch of folks we've hired most recently. So we have, I think, 4 regional coordinators now. So it's Region 9, Region 7, Region 5, and Region 3. And then we have a part-time on Long Island in Region 1, which has been amazing. So we can get way more local buy-in and local expertise, which I can't do from central office in Albany. So that's been wonderful. We also have a research scientist who oversees our eDNA program. So he's involved in helping to track the distribution of northern snakehead in the Delaware River and the area around there, and also looking at round goby, which recently made its way from the Mohawk River into the Hudson. And we're tracking with USGS and several other partners, making sure that they're staying outside of the Champlain Canal. So these are really important projects that we're involved in.
So eDNA is pretty cool. Can you just talk to us a little bit more about what that is and how we use it to monitor invasive species spread?
Sure. So any living thing will basically shed cells or tissue, and that can be picked up in water or air. And we essentially collect a water sample, filter it, and then whatever is on the filter is then analyzed using, I'm going to use technical terms, qPCR, metabarcoding, things like that, to assess what's present. So generally you have a primer, which is basically a code that's particular to a species or animal or plant that you would compare the results from your analysis to see if it's a hit for that particular species. And I'm probably making this way too general, but so you would assess that, and it will tell you whether or not it's present. But again, we always have a sort of a cautionary approach to the use of eDNA. So a positive could mean that there may be something present, but it may also mean that tissue, for whatever reason, happened to be in that area. So in some cases, someone may have been, however they found it, they may have been, butchering a northern snakehead on the side of a lake, and they tossed whatever was left over into the lake, but the fish was not actually in the lake or in a particular river. So that may be where it's been picked up. So we have to be careful about how we interpret the results. And we like to say that we think of it as sort of a harbinger of what may be heading our way, which was definitely the case with round goby, as we saw those positive hits before an actual physical fish was caught using e-shocking. So that was coming for several years. We could track the round goby along the Mohawk River as it moves toward the Hudson. So in that case, we definitely see it as something that will sort of a warning sign to us to do additional surveys and definitely try to get those physical samples of the organisms if possible.
What are some of the most common misconceptions that everyday New Yorkers have about invasive species for either of you?
So we did talk about zebra mussels and quagga mussels and how folks think they're really beneficial to the waters because when they're present, the water is clearer. But what's actually happening is the zebra mussels and quagga mussels are really good at filtering out the phytoplankton and the zooplankton, which are the very, very tiny plants and animals that other native animals in those water systems rely upon. So they're disappearing, which means those animals aren't supported. And there's also this penetration of the sunlight which goes much deeper into the water than it normally would have. So it actually helps the aquatic invasive plants to spread further and grow more. So it's kind of what we would call a little bit of an invasional meltdown.
And I'd say from the forest health realm, people like green. They like a lot of trees or a lot of growth. And I know when we were controlling kudzu downstate, some of the landowners didn't want us to remove it because it was a nice blanket of green that they could look upon, every day. But it is killing trees and killing all the other diverse species eventually that grow there. So otherwise, I feel like New Yorkers at this point are pretty well educated about invasive species, maybe compared to other areas. I think New York has always been a leader in invasive species management, and the public has come along with us and generally, I think, has a pretty good knowledge.
Definitely a testament to the efforts of you two and the teams behind you and that you work with. And it's great to hear that. And I'm glad that educational message is penetrating New Yorkers, because we really need each and every one of them to really pay attention to this. And when we think about the future and looking at, New York being a global hub for transportation, and obviously a lot of that has contributed to what we see in invasive species, obviously Asian longhorn beetle being, I think, one of the ones that's probably fresh on New Yorkers' mind. But how are we monitoring what could potentially be coming into the state in the future, and what steps are we taking to address that?
The monitoring issue is really interesting because Cathy just talked about eDNA. We have so many new tools to surveil our forests and our waterways, and it's been really effective, but sometimes it reveals more information than you wanted, So we do a lot of monitoring. We do early detection trapping, where we deploy insect traps at high-risk sites and look for new interceptions of specific pests. We do annual aerial surveys with a plane, and then subsequently map areas with damage and go out and ground truth those areas. We take a lot of public reports. That relationship with the public is really important because something like 95% of all new species are found by the public. There's a lot more of you out there than there are of us, so we definitely need that component. And then now we have all these new genomic tools available to us. And just an example, we did a meta-barcoding project recently where we sent all of our insect trapping bycatch from across the state, the last 4 years of trapping, to a lab to have it meta-barcoded, which is where you're looking for all the species that are in that sample, not just, some techniques like PCR can be species specific. This is to try to capture everything. And it came back with something like 1,500 species. And of those, we found 32 that had never been known to be in North America. So right now we're in a process of following up to try to see if we can capture some of those more rare or significant ones, because as Cathy said, it could just be false positive, So it's just like, well, these weren't even on our radar. We look to our neighboring states and what they're dealing with, and we try to anticipate things. And there are, global or national priority pest lists and things like that. So just by collaborating with our partners, we usually have a pretty good idea of what's coming, But what do you do with the things that, weren't on those lists that you didn't even anticipate? So it's an exciting time because our surveillance powers have been greatly increased. But what do we do with that information, and can we still respond? How do we choose what to respond to?
How should people be sharing that information with DEC?
For invasive species, we have isinfo@dec.ny.gov. We get our emails with photos, and putting in a plug for please put in an object for scale. Use a light background so we can see the leaves and animals properly, and we can always follow up and do a site visit to confirm. And also encourage people to make reports to IMAP Invasives, because we follow up on those as well.
Awesome.
So reporting is definitely key, but what are some of the other steps people can take, not just reporting what they see, but how can they help stop the spread of invasive species?
I have a number of things that I can recommend for folks to do
for it.
regarding aquatic invasive species. So I recommend that folks keep up to date about what aquatic invasive species or invasive species are problematic in your region, and then maybe in your lake if you have a particular place that you're very fond of. Learn to identify some of those and report them to IMAP. That's really helpful to us. Learn which plants or animals are recommended for particular things. So I'm encouraging folks to learn which plants are recommended for aquatic gardens and how to place your aquatic garden, because in some cases, if you have a storm event, there may be flooding, and it will basically carry those plants into a waterway, and then we'll have an infestation downstream, which is not ideal. Also, think about what you purchased for your aquarium. Be a really informed pet owner. If the plant or animal is not appropriate for you, and in the long term, because some of these animals do live a very long time, don't purchase that plant or animal. And also be aware of what you're purchasing online, because just because it's online and available for sale doesn't mean it's not invasive. So I encourage people to make informed choices about their pets and aquaria, and also just whatever, even if you're not happy with what's in your aquarium, don't release it into any public or private water bodies, please, please. And if you have trouble deciding what to do with it, contact us. We can help you.
Great advice.
Nice.
I would like a success story from either of you. The greatest New York invasive species success story. What did we catch and prevent the spread of?
I'm going to go for Croton.
Okay.
So the Croton River Hydrilla Management Project. So Croton, hydrilla was discovered there in 2013 by a New York, Bronx Botanical Garden or New York Botanical Garden botanist while he was doing a survey. And then 2 years later, we did a dye study, which we basically had to do to assess the project area after the infestation had been delineated. So that helped us to determine whether or not we could move forward with a management project and what that would look like. And also as part of that season, we did a survey of 49 locations north and south of Croton along the Hudson to assess whether or not hydrilla had escaped from the Croton River to other locations. Because if it had, we would not have moved forward on the Croton River project because essentially, as they like to say, the cow was out of the barn.
Yep.
And we found no hydrilla. So we got a green light for that. We did the dye study to assess the flow, I don't know how to describe it, the flow movement or the changes in tide, because it's a tidal system at the mouth of the Croton River. So we had to assess what kind of retention time we would have for an herbicide there and what that would look like. So once we had that data, we moved forward. It took us 2 years after that to get a project in place, but we were able to finish up the project in October of 2022. And we had no hydrilla found there, which was actually for about 3 seasons. So at that point, we were able to transition to monitoring, and we're now in the restoration and monitoring phase. So to me, that was a big win.
Absolutely. And an example of how necessary it is to engage with local residents to make sure they understand what's happening, what the benefits are, and how careful and deliberate we are in trying to manage these invasive pests.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that was a big lesson in communications.
Yep.
And how important they are to any project. The science is really important, of course, but the communication is crucial.
Yeah.
And Jess, you mentioned Long Island earlier as well, and obviously southern pine beetle is a big threat to the pine barrens, and we're actively engaged in a lot of management down there. Can you talk a little bit about that work that's underway and how it's contributing to the forest health of the pine barrens?
Yeah, of course. When southern pine beetle arrived on Long Island, there had been a recent history of no forest management and fire suppression on top of that. There was a wildfire on Long Island in the 90s that really scared people. And, after that, a priority was to suppress fire. But as a result, the pitch pine barrens evolved into a highly dense forested stand of pitch pine and some oaks. But we, I won't say we necessarily lost species, but some of the rare and endangered plants that are associated with pine barrens started disappearing or becoming more restricted. And we just lost a lot of biodiversity. And it was just replaced with, like I said, extremely high density forests. And so when southern pine beetle arrived, it had a field day. And when we first found it, it moved so fast. Sometimes the beetle is compared to like a wildfire because it can kill a tree in 4 to 6 weeks. And so within the first couple months of surveying, we found probably over 100,000 trees dead already. And people were really impacted. And of course, the ecosystems were really impacted. And that still continues to this day. We see ups and downs in terms of outbreaks. So what we've done is take a more preventative strategy. You can suppress southern pine beetle by cutting infested trees in the summer when the spots are expanding. But given the area is so small on Long Island, spots are all adjacent to each other. And so some are worth suppressing, but beetles are just moving all over the place. So we thought a better strategy was to preventatively manage those stands and try to restore them back to the Pine Barrens ecosystem. And so we do that through thinning, forest thinning. But what the thinning also does is opens up the canopy so that the pheromones that southern pine beetle communicate with are dissipated more easily into the air. So they have a harder time communicating and mass attacking trees. These are tiny little beetles that can't do any damage on their own, and their whole strategy is to congregate, hundreds of thousands of them at once on one tree, and that's how they overcome a tree's defenses. So if they can't communicate, they can't organize to attack a tree. And then on top of the thinning, we've also started initiating prescribed fire, which was a really long-term effort. Our team has been working on that for many years, again, because of a history of fire suppression. And we are helping to support the Central Pine Barrens Commission on Long Island and helping them to build their fire program.
It's really great work overall, and it's so awesome just to hear you go in the science of all of this. And it takes a lot of science to manage this effectively, and then obviously take that and translate that out to everyday New Yorkers who should be aware of this. And just because you see a tree being cut or a forest being thinned, this is actually working at the long-term health of that, and that's an important message to get across. But my question for you, just transitioning out of this and more into the two of you, what brought you to DEC, and how did you know that DEC was doing all this work, and what made you want to join the state to do it?
For me, it was really kind of a slow evolution. I didn't anticipate getting into this career until much later, and it wasn't until my late 20s that I went back to school for environmental science. I was a wildlife biology major at SUNY ESF, but then I needed a job after school. I hadn't really thought about it until suddenly it was time to think about it, and I was lucky enough to get this job with Forest Health, and my job at the time was to start our lab, our Forest Health Research and Diagnostic Lab. And so I got right into entomology right away, which wasn't something I had really been exposed to much. And I just loved it. I felt like working with insects was way easier than mammals, where you have to trap them and tag them, and you could just put out traps and they would come to you, and then you could put them under a microscope. And it just kind of evolved since then, I had no forestry background or anything like that. So when I came into the Forest Health program, I was working with a lot of foresters. And then I became just kind of fascinated with tree physiology and forestry and good forest management. And that was all stuff that just came afterwards. So I had zero knowledge of any of this as a young person.
So, Cathy, were you always into aquatic invasives, or did this come as part of the job as well?
I had taken an ecology class, 2 ecology classes, junior, senior year, and I realized how much I loved it, and I thought I could actually get paid to do this, which would be amazing. So I switched it up and went and got a master's at Duke at their primate center, and I studied lemur behavior for 2 years. But I realized that I really loved the lemurs, but I didn't really love behavioral studies. And I really didn't like the fact that my thesis would sit on a shelf for the rest of its life. So I wanted to do something more applied. So I actually took time off and did a bunch of these smaller jobs as field assistant across the country at different locations. And I learned all these different skills and tested out, what do I really like and what would I do? And I got a Polgar fellowship to do a small mammals in the marshes of the Hudson River to test out where they were using the habitat and what kind of health they were in, and actually what species were actually there. So that was sort of the launching for my PhD project, which focused on the impacts of some invasive plants in marshes, 6 marshes in the Hudson River. So I looked at the mammals, birds, and macroinvertebrates. For me, there's no real straight path between what I started out with and where I ended up. And I was super excited to be able to start the program. I mean, as the first coordinator for an AIS program that didn't exist until July 1st of 2015. You get to have that entire vision and bring that plan into fruition. It's really awesome. So that was an opportunity I couldn't pass up.
Thank you both for being on the show. We'll let you get back to your important efforts around the state, and just thank you for all your work on behalf of all New Yorkers keeping our forests and aquatic ecosystems healthy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Well, Erica, that was an awesome conversation with our invasive species experts. I learned a lot more than what I already knew, but it was fun to really hear their perspectives on their important work that they're doing and really what everyday New Yorkers can do to help in our fight against invasive species. But Erica, I know coming up here, we've got some more invasive species events. It was Invasive Species Awareness Week, but what more do we have on the horizon?
So another invasive species that's been making news lately is the Joro spider. There have been reports that it is coming north to the Northeast, particularly New York. We checked in with the DEC entomologists here at the agency and did a little digging on the Joro spider. This is an invasive species that is native to Asia. It made its way to the U.S. About 15 years ago-ish. Currently, there are Joro spiders all across the South, mostly in Georgia, South and North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, etc. They are projected to make landfall in New York State in the next year or so. Our folks don't feel like that is imminent. These spiders can survive, but they don't love cold winters. So we've got that going for us. But the important things to note, despite the hyperbole, should I say, about the Joro spider, is that although we expect them to compete with some native species of spider, and they look very similar to yellow garden spiders that are common here in New York, and some of them are kind of big, we're not expecting any major impacts on New York State, on crops, on other species. It hurts when they bite. This is true, but Joro spiders are not the stuff of nightmares.
So, Erica, what else has gone on?
Well, we recently announced it's the start of HABs season.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, that's the right tone to take. These are harmful algal blooms that occur in New York's waters, especially as temperatures are rising. They are the result of a combination of a lot of things: warmer water temperatures, sometimes turbidity, sometimes it's nutrient pollution in a waterway. They've been around since the dinosaurs, but increasing in frequency. So what we are trying to do every year is help New Yorkers to know it, avoid it, and report it. And to report harmful algal blooms, we have a pretty fabulous interface called NYHABs. Check it out on our website, dec.ny.gov, and just search for HABs. And we encourage people to submit photographs and reports. So HABs can vary in appearance. They can look like scattered green dots in the water. They can look like green streaks. They can look like spilled pea soup or green paint. Sometimes they're white. Sometimes they're bluish green. And whether or not, because we don't know right away from looking at it if a bloom is toxic, but our guiding sort of advice is to avoid it. People, pets, and livestock should avoid any contact with water that is discolored or shows the presence of a HAB, a harmful algal bloom, and report it if necessary.
So coming up this summer, we'll get some of our HAB experts on to really talk more about that, since it is a statewide issue that gets a lot of attention this time of year as people are out and about enjoying New York's awesome water-based recreation opportunities and spending more time in the water. Know it, avoid it, and report it. But importantly for this episode, clean, drain, and dry your boats. That's one of the key ways to protect our waterways from invasive species. But this was a great show today, and most importantly, we want to continue to hear from you on the content and topics that you want to hear about. So please email us at contact@dec.ny.gov. Let us know how we're doing and what you want to hear more about. But most importantly, Erica, what should every New Yorker do?
Get outside.
DEC Does What is a production of DEC's Division of Communication, Education, and Engagement. Our theme music is an original composition by Mike Menza, wildlife technician with DEC's Division of Fish and Wildlife. Like what you heard on this episode? Please leave a review and share this episode with others. Want to learn more about DEC's wide-ranging efforts to protect New Yorkers and the environment? Visit dec.ny.gov or connect with us on social media. You can find us using @NYSDEC. For more information on DEC Does What, visit dec.ny.gov/podcast.